This is it, ladies and gentlemen. Arguably the most successful tool ever invented, found on all the continents, in use for 1.5 million years. This tool is the beginning of our story. This tool and all the tools that followed it are what made us human. All right, so we have 4 experts to help us through this tonight. First, our first participant heads up the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program. He's a paleoanthropologist who leads excavations at early human sites in the East African Rift Valley, including the famous hand axe sites in Kenya. Please welcome Rick Potts. For our first segment, we'll also be joined by an anthropologist who is the chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. He studies how culture has shaped our species' genetic evolution, what drives innovation, and the process of cumulative cultural evolution. Please welcome Joe Henrich. Welcome, sir. So, Rick, you are the guy in like the Indiana Jones movies. You're the guy digging around in the dust.
Yes, that's what I do. I like to dig in layers and layers and layers of dirt. I travel to Kenya every year. This will be this summer the 36th year in a row of doing excavations in the Rift Valley of southern Kenya. And also occasionally I do digs in China. And so people say, you know, you travel a lot, Rick. And I say, yeah, but I think of myself as a time traveler. Because as we dig down into the layers of dirt, we get into older and older time periods. And it's amazing what we can discover there.
Well, including hand axes.
Hand axes, yeah. The site where I've been working for 36 years now is the most famous stone hand axe site in Africa, perhaps the world. Originally discovered by the famed Louis and Mary Leakey in the 1940s. And so Mary Leakey was a mentor of mine, and she said, Rick, why don't you, this is in the 1980s, she said, why don't you go to this site, a site with an unpronounceable name, Alorgesailie, even though I just pronounced it. It's a Maasai word, and it's in Maasai country in southern Kenya. A fascinating place to work, both culturally, but also in terms of prehistory, archaeology, paleontology, all those ologies that deal with human origins.
And what did you start out looking for when you went there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought I would be there for 3 years. I had a 3-year grant. Now we're in our 3rd decade.
Oh.
And it turned out that it was thought to be a site where there was a single or maybe a few layers of hand axes. One of them, a very, very famous site that Mary Leakey had discovered in April of 1942, where there was a walkway that was built around it for people to come and look at it, where there are over 500 hand axes all gathered in one spot. And I thought, okay, I'd like to go back and look at that and to dig other hand axe sites, and it was thought to be a very short period of time. Well, within 3 years, we learned through advances in the technology of dating geological sediments, that the site, this particular site, had layers and layers of sediment spanning the last 1 million years, more than 1 million years, actually. And so we had an opportunity then to not only study hand axes, but also whether there were changes in hand axes over time and how the environments were changing, which really posed tremendous survival challenges to the early humans who made hand axes. And as it turned out, we discovered much more than just the hand axes at that site.
When you were referring to the advances in dating technology, I thought you were talking about Tinder. But
yeah,
I guess that's
not that one. No,
not the same thing.
No.
So for both of you, how is a new tool invented? Is it one person with a brilliant idea? Is it a community effort? How does that come about?
It's females, right?
Well, it's
no, yeah.
females.
I mean, there are examples of that.
A division of labor. I mean, one of the ideas I've worked on is that humans have this collective brain and we learn from each other, and a lot of the most important inventions come from recombinations of ideas taken from different people.
Huh. So tell us more about this collective brain. That's been a subject of your
Yeah, yeah.
Not
So the idea is that to really understand innovation in humans, we have to recognize that we learn from each other and we transmit information non-genetically, so cultural information, down across the generations. And this gives rise to an accumulation of this information, of cultural knowledge, know-how, how to make tools, also languages, and that this means that larger, more interconnected groups produce this process faster, and so you actually generate faster rates of innovation. So if you want to increase innovation, you want a larger, more interconnected population, and you can see that even if you just look at the size of U.S. cities. So larger U.S. cities produce more patents, and it's nonlinear, so it's superlinear, meaning that as you increase the population size, you get an extra boost. It's as if everybody in the city gets a bit smarter, and because they're more likely to have an innovation. You can see this back in time, looking at small-scale societies. You can go to the Pacific and look at the size of different islands in Oceania. The larger islands and that are more interconnected with other islands make fancier tools. They have fancier sink baskets and different kinds of fish hooks. And if you go to the smaller, more remote islands, it's a more simple technology. And we have become so dependent on the products of this collective brain, on this large body of culturally inherited information, that we've become addicted to it. So one of the examples I like to use is if we take members of this audience and we then took a troop of capuchin monkeys and we parachuted you into the Ettore forest and played a game of Survivor. You might think that the big-brained Homo sapiens would win, but we wouldn't know how to make tools or find food or process the food. We would need to cook the food. Whereas the capuchins, who are a South American species, they'd be in a new environment, but they'd be probably much more likely to survive. So we've become addicted to this body of tools and technology and know-how.
Right, and our collective brain also is, I would argue, slower to move. Like climate change. Like we can't pivot. We can't.
Yeah, well, because we're reliant on information from the past, so sometimes it's harder to innovate. Yeah. But because we rely on this recombination process,
right,
take us forward.
You mentioned some historical examples of smart people and smart inventions. Have we always been equally smart and our tools equally sophisticated for the time? I mean, the Egyptians had these rudimentary tools to build the pyramids, and the French had these cool tools to build the Notre Dame. And those have lasted for hundreds, thousands of years. So, and we've got the iPhone. So, are we each equally smart in our way, and our tools equally sophisticated?
Well, so I think the way I think about it is that one of the things we're adapting to our environment by learning from other people. We're learning from more successful and more skilled individuals. So this adapts us to the ecology and may come with new mental tools. So, for example, things like numbering systems or categorization systems for plants and animals. Some small-scale societies have very complex categorization systems, which allows them to figure out what's edible and what's not and classify things. But they might only count 1, 2, 3, many. Whereas, we get this unbounded counting system that allows us to count, really, we can differentiate 27 and 28. So it's a mental tool that allows us to do new cognitive tasks. And there's lots of examples like that.
1, 2, 3, many?
Yeah, that's a very common counting system across societies.
Wait, that's not an exaggeration or a joke. That's like...
No, so like the group I worked with in the Peruvian Amazon count 1, 2, 3, many.
Oh, man!
Yeah. I mean, so in New Guinea you can find groups that can count to 12, 27. It's often based on a body counting system. So, we're base 10 because there's 10 digits, right? So that's a case where it's actually, but you'll count these 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then those body terms turn into number words.
Wild. And one more thing, in your research you've used the term cultural downloads.
Yeah, so I was mentioning the examples of the capuchin monkeys in the Ettore forest, but in order to survive that, we're getting this large body of information about where to find foods and how to make tools and how to make shelters and medicinal plants, and this download of pre-solved solutions. And some of these include these simple heuristics, like when to plant your crops. You wait till the first weeds begin to poke out and then you plant the seeds. It's a heuristic the Mapuche, the group that I worked with in South America, use, that make us seem smart, but we seem smarter than we are because of all these this accumulated body of know-how.
Do you also go on
Yeah, so I do field work. I've worked in the Peruvian Amazon and Chile, and for the last 13 years in the South Pacific.
But that's not digging up stuff. That's
Studying. So I do kind of psychological experiments, ethnography with diverse populations.
wow, that's very cool. And Rick, we referenced in humorous fashion obsidian before. What's the big difference between an obsidian axe and a stone axe?
Well, first, let's look at yourself, or you mean your hand axe there.
It's actually like plastic.
Yeah, it's an exact replica of a hand axe. It's not one that I dug up, but in any case, it does come from an African site, and as you can see, it's kind of
This one comes from China.
This one, it doesn't. I found the first ones that
Oh
came
my
from China.
This is a bad place to make jokes like that. Like, this is the guy who found them.
In any case, pointed at one end and sort of rounded at the other. And I think of this as the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age. It was useful for a whole variety of things. So you could chip it and use the sharp slivers of stone to butcher animals, or to whittle a digging stick to dig up tubers and roots to eat, or to dig for water under the ground, things like that. And so it was very, very useful. And these hand axes were around for 1 3/4 million years. Is the dominant form of human technology. I don't even know what version of Windows I should be. I remember slide rules. I mean, these things are of the rapidity
I was
of.
working on the same joke, but yours is better.
Oh, okay. Well, but the dominant form of human technology for 1 3/4 million years. At the field site where I work, you see them in layer after layer after layer for 700,000 years. And the rock was pretty much all obtained from within about 2 miles of where you find them, okay? And so very localized kind of adaptation. They were these ancestors of ours, probably the species known as Homo erectus. We're Homo sapiens, but an ancestor of us had a very, very smart understanding of their local environments. Well, what happens is that in the field site where I work, these went extinct about 500,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago. And last year we announced the discovery of the beginning of human innovation. So this represents, it seems like the same old for a long, long period of time, a kind of culture, a kind of technology, a kind of learning that does not exist in the present among human populations for the most part, but built on the foundation of that kind of learning and technology was the beginning of innovation, and that included the use of obsidian. And I have a piece of obsidian here. And this is a real piece of obsidian. I know because I already cut my finger on it about 2 hours ago. Wow. Some of you, if you happen to be fans of a particular television program that just went extinct, is known as Dragon Glass. But in any case, it's the same stuff. In that particular show, Game of Thrones, displayed very, very accurately what obsidian looks like geologically. In any case,
it's glass?
It's volcanic glass. It is, when fractured, the sharpest known substance. In fact, surgeons will sometimes prefer this over steel for surgery because it hardly leaves any scar.
Seems a little clunky.
It's a bit, yeah. Well, what we found in our work was the transition from the big and clunky to the small and portable. And the history of technology has been the same ever since. And what we found in sites that are around the same age as the oldest fossil evidence of our species, Homo sapiens, in Africa, a little over 300,000 years ago, were these small obsidian points. And they were made over and over again in the same way, but in a new way of what I call stone tool chess, that you could flake the stone with a hammerstone or with a bone or a stick, and in a way that you could predict exactly with one strike the size and shape, thinness, and everything of what would come off. And it was the first assembly lines of making these points, and they were chipped on the end so that they could be hafted, connected with a shaft. They're the first projectile weapons, the first projectile points. And the history of the world has never been the same since. Wow. Things that fly through the air. And so they're much smaller than this. This would have been the kind of rock that would have been transported up to over 50 miles away from obsidian sources. And that's much further than what we think the early humans were walking. And so it's also evidence of the first social networks, of basically connecting one group with another group with another group with another group. And the obsidian, big pieces of obsidian were passed along. And we happened to dig at one site in southern Kenya where those big pieces ended up, and they had this new innovative technology made largely out of this obsidian from a long distance away. In addition to that, we also found the first use from these same archaeological sites of pigments, the use of coloring material, red and black pigments, which is often seen as the beginning of the human capacity to symbolize, to create. In fact, there's up on the screen there are some of the processed red and black pigments, as well as some of the obsidian points. So we have a real change at around the origin of our species 300,000, 320,000 years ago to a new way of behavior that involved human innovation.
You must know this, Rick, but this act of chipping away to make smaller spearheads and stuff, known as napping with a
Napping,
K, right?
Yeah, with a K. Yeah.
Is still a thing. Like there are napping festivals in this country.
There are.
Where people get together and sit around and make spearheads.
And you can be an early human for a day.
Well, or maybe they're thinking ahead. Climate change. Right. Okay.
Can I just make a point about the tools? I think one of the most fascinating things about the stone tools is the way they shaped our genetic evolution. So once we became able to use the tools, one of the things that hominids used tools for was to cut and process meat and other hard foods, which released the selection pressures to have these large jaws and big teeth and their sagittal crest that you see in non-human primates with the big jaw muscles, because we pre-digest our food in a couple different ways by cutting, and also fire and cooking breaks that stuff down. So then our digestive system and our teeth and all adapt to this. So we're co-evolving with our tools and our technology over hundreds of thousands of years.
So our tools are physically changing our bodies.
Right.
Crazy! And yet a perfect segue into part 2, which is called How Our Tools Shape Us. Thank you for the Game of Thrones reference. That's a perfect cue to move on into our second part. We have 2 more guests to join us for this segment. Our next guest is a Canada Research Chair in Digital Life, Media and Culture, and an Associate Professor at Ontario Tech University. She founded Decimal Lab, a digital culture and media lab that concentrates on the social implications of emerging technology. Please welcome Dr. Isabel Peterson. How are things in Canada? Finally, we have an NYU professor of philosophy who specializes in philosophy of the mind and cognitive science. He also researches issues about artificial intelligence and the extended mind. Please welcome David Chalmers. So, Isabel, Marshall McLuhan wrote that line about we shape our tools and in turn they shape us. Is there a parallel with what these guys were saying about ancient tools like the hand axe and the modern technologies that you study?
Well, McLuhan was really talking about the change from print culture to moving image culture, right? From radio to television and film, and was commenting on the way that society is changing, culture is changing. We see ourselves differently as we're reflected in this media. So I think that Joe mentioned quite a bit about how changes culture is spread across culture, that you're socialized according to the changes in the work that you do in the everyday, or how you entertain yourselves, or the kinds of music and the way that people celebrate. So I think, but what's interesting about McLuhan is these days, what he said had such foresight, right, with data culture, and that we're being shaped by the data sphere that we're experiencing.
Meaning, you don't mean like our plastic brains are changing, do you?
That's out of my area. The evolutionary biologist might have more to say about that, but
our thought patterns, you mean?
the way that we live our lives is changing because of it. The way that we socialize, the way that we imagine our future is changing.
Right. David, I'm fascinated by this notion of mind extension. Is it going too far to say that the way the stone axe was an extension of our bodies, so is the smartphone an extension of our minds?
I think that's pretty well right. Every technology, in a way, serves to extend ourselves. A good technology that we use basically becomes part of us. A hand axe, I guess, becomes an extension of our limbs, giving us extra power. The car becomes an extension of us, giving us a way of moving around. But many of these technologies are basically extensions of our bodies. I think one thing that's really interesting about modern technology is that it's increasingly actually serving as extensions of our mind or our brain. Functions that used to be performed by my brains, like remembering phone numbers. I mean, who remembers a phone number with their brain anymore? I can't remember the last time I did that. It's my phone is actually serving as my memory, an extension of my mind. Google Maps is serving as part of my navigation system. We used to have a hippocampus for that to get around. Well, now it's gradually atrophying and being taken over by Google Maps, by navigation software, which can often do this stuff a whole lot better. So, extending the mind is not new. When writing was invented, it served as a kind of a form of memory and collective memory that served to extend the mind. So mind extension technology has been around for a long time, but now I think we're living in the era where it's becoming absolutely central.
Yeah, I miss epic Homeric poems. We just don't write those anymore.
I just want to quickly make the point, though, that these technologies, there's no doubt that they change our brains in plastic ways. So the best studied case of this, which is related to what you said, is when you become literate. So when you learn to read, you get specialized circuitry in your left ventral hemisphere, your corpus callosum, that's the information highway that connects your brain, that gets thicker. You get a longer verbal memory, even though you're doing reading. So your brain is renovated, it's reshaped when you learn to read as a child, and this has effects on our psychology besides in the domain of reading.
Wow. Yeah, for one of the NOVA episodes we did, we interviewed two scientists who did a functional MRI scan of 10, 14-year-old girls who had never played video games. Apparently they exist. And then they had them play video games for 3 hours a day for 6 weeks, and then they gave them another scan, and they could see the parts of their brain that had swelled, that like a muscle had been worked out. So it really is plastic. That concludes my scientific contribution to the panel.
Well, I think that goes all the way back to the origin of language and of symbolism. I mean, we live our lives in a virtual world, in a world of symbols, of imagination, of meaning that we make as human beings that consists of, if you look all the way back to the time period I was talking about, these colors. Well, why should color be meaningful? Well, look at all the ways in which black and red and other colors are used in flags, uniforms. They end up meaning so much more than what you might expect just from the material it is. And language itself bathes our brains from childhood, from infanthood, in this new environment that develops in ways that affects its development in the ways that, Joe, you were mentioning. And as that symbolic sphere goes outside of our own brains and connects with others, not only through language, but now through all sorts of media, that's going to shape not only our brains, but all of society. We think of our brains as inside of our head, but I think of our brains as being whoever you're mind reading with. And that can include through telephones with all the digital media.
I mean, people talk about the exocortex. The science fiction writer Charles Stross, in his book Accelerando, imagined a future where we all have a exocortex, which is all the tools that we use that extend our brain. Well, I already have a exocortex here with my Apple Watch and my iPhone and the cloud just a few clicks away. It's all basically part of my brain. It's not like my brain is actually atrophying. My brain is expanding to include all of these tools which are extending it.
Is there a tool that extends both our bodies and our minds?
There are some. Here is an example of one, brain-computer interfaces, which are coming pretty fast. This is getting into the future.
Yeah.
Too soon. Okay.
Isabel's got a prop.
Oh, very good. Okay. Very good. So brain-computer interfaces can be used for people to actually control things in their environment with like tools. You can move a limb around And so we can also use it to extend your brain-computer. Are we getting ahead of ourselves here?
Yeah,
We're
totally.
totally ruining
Well,
this.
no, it doesn't go that way. It
Sorry,
goes the
I
other
did it
way.
wrong.
So yes,
go
indeed,
ahead.
this is
ahead.
a brain-computer interface. It uses EEG, electroencephalography, which is an older technology, and it reads fluctuation in the brain. But this one was designed and meant for helping people meditate or de-stress and relax, and they monitor their brain fluctuation to get themselves relaxed. But this is getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but in my lab, we re-engineered it to to help people view paintings. We attached it to a collection of paintings, digitized paintings from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we coded 100 paintings so that you can use this brain interface to select the kind of art that you want to look at according to your emotional state. But we did this as a media arts project that we wanted to basically challenge the future. Is this really sort of robbing us of our creative future? Is it something that's helping us? So we did this in order to explore the future, not to promote this future.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so you studied these in the lab.
Yes. Yeah, we had to re-engineer the software.
Yeah.
We rewrote an algorithm to do this.
Because out of the box, it sucks.
Right.
Yeah, I tried those on Nova, and I was supposed to fly a model helicopter with my brain.
Right.
And I'm like, oh, I give up. No, like and it was explained to me by one of our scientists that trying to pick up brain signals through your skull with a consumer is like it's like you're sitting at the edge of a pond, and a ripple comes to the shore. You're trying to identify what was dropped in the middle of the pond by the ripple. It's
absolutely crude. This is baby steps, but we thought that this is the future promise for technology, that you will be able to use digital telepathy to at home, that you'll be able to make selections for television shows you want to watch or streaming media that you want to watch. All of that will play out with a brain-computer interface in the future. So we decided that we need to begin to make these prototypes now to understand, as the technology comes online, that it's able to do these things, what will happen. But for us, it was also an ironic piece. I mean, we called it I Mind, and that's a play on words. I mind that you're reading my mind. And it was great fun. I mean, people, it only had it tracks 4 emotions. So it tracked whether you were sort of angry or urgent or, calm or sad and happy. And every once in a while, we found someone come in and get quite excited, and we would suddenly see different paintings from the Paul Klee collection appear. And, we put them on screen so it would fill the room with paintings that no one had ever seen, because supposedly their brainwaves were in that kind of mode. But absolutely crude still. Baby steps.
I mean, they can do cool stuff like when they implant something, but we'll get to that. Yeah,
right.
That's a little different.
But actually, you find that these, your question on extending the body, extending the mind, actually our body has been one of the primary ways of extending our mind right from the start. Say about counting. We mentioned counting earlier. What do we count on? Our fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's actually performing a mental function with the aid of my body. 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. Okay, well now I'm screwed. Okay, well, now to get higher, well, there are my toes and so on. But okay, pretty soon we're going to need some of those rocks. Maybe we'll use some hand axes to count on. So suddenly those things that were extending our body are now extending our mind. Now the cars, which are extending our body, maybe they've got some navigation software built in, and they're extending our mind at the same time.
One of my favorite examples of this, you can find these on YouTube, is when you train children in the mental abacus. So the abacus is a physical product that takes advantage of how we group in space, our spatial cognition. So it allows us to do all kinds of fancy math. You can train children on the spatial abacus and then eventually have them put it aside and just use a mental version of it. And they can do incredible computations that no one could ever do. And you can see them, they'll be like looking up in the sky, moving their fingers around as if they're actually manipulating it, but it's just...
And that works?
They have races with people on calculators, and the abacus kids win.
It is so cool. We were talking about hand axes. Okay. So, Rick, why did the hand axe last so long? I mean, hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, it seems like compared to something like the iPhone 6S. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time indeed, yeah. I remember a conference that I was attending where two papers were presented suggesting that in order for the hand axe to stay around for so long, it had to have been passed on in some cultural manner, and these early humans must have had language in order to pass it on, because that's how we transmit information to one another. And the professor who was introducing this really old guy who was just there, but one of the most wonderful people, very insightful about everything, and he stood up to introduce the next paper, and he said, well, if they were using language to make those hand axes for such a long time, they must have been saying the same thing over and over again for a very long time, which meant it wasn't the same kind of culture that we have today, which is very mutable and which is very able to have sense of invention and to link up with people, larger and larger groups of people that can stimulate innovation. And it's really not until that you get that sense of people relying upon other people at some distance and forming these networks, whereby the 10 or 12 people who were early humans who went around the landscape ended up, because they could exchange information and resources with other groups, became maybe 100. And that was the beginning of that point of inflection to human innovation. And so I think that was an absolutely critical point. We don't understand very well about how hand axes could be around for so long, but it's a different mode of behavior from what characterizes our species, Homo sapiens.
When we contemplate the longevity of these tools, I mean, you must do some of this, Isabel, at your lab. Mm-hmm. Like, have you ever thought, like this is the iPhone 10, like what the iPhone 1000 will be like? I mean, I hope it'll have better battery life.
Yeah.
But
we certainly try to do that. So we have a lot of gadgets and devices at Decimal Lab. We're basically building a museum because the lifespan of some of these devices is only a year or two. They're almost instantly obsolete. But one thing that I think is interesting about this panel is we spend a great deal of time thinking about the history of artifacts, of where they come from, and what processes, how we get there. I think we need to also begin to think of the future that way too, right? We need to project studies 200-300 years into the future in order to basically get in front of innovation and get in front of how society is affected by it. So I think we're good at studying thousands and thousands of years of the past, but we're not as good about looking to the future.
But isn't that because it's impossible?
I don't think it is. Following what many of you have already said, the seeds for invention are in our culture, right? All of it is beginning to play out now, right? Our expectations, our motivation for our digital devices is something that we're currently exploring at this time. So also, I mean, this is another artifact that this is a 2002 heads-up display that is this would have been before Google Glass, right? 10 years before Google Glass. So we've been making heads-up displays now for 30 or 40 years. There's no reason why we shouldn't begin to think to the future, to understand how we're going to use them and what effects they're going to have on us and our well-being.
Do you think, so I've been, as a tech observer, I've been amused by the struggles of wearables to try to catch on. I mean, like, I'm finally starting to see Apple Watches on people, but like for many years you'd walk down an airplane aisle and nope, and Google Glass crashed and burned, and everyone always asks me at the end of a talk, so we're gonna have implants in our brains. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, like you need surgery to replace your phone? Like, who's gonna stand for that? So like what is you had a project called the Wearable Past? What's that about? You maintain that
Yeah.
wearables have been around?
Well, this the project, the Wearable Past, was a collaboration that my lab did with the Canada Science and Tech Museum in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada.
Wait,
And,
it's not Toronto?
No, not Toronto. And they had a wearables exhibit, and it's a physical exhibit that tries to look to past wearables that informed our wearable present, right? The way that we're using wearables now. So none of it is really new. I mean, Google Glass has precursors. So this is a picture of a spy camera from 1886.
You'd never noticed that.
The curator at the exhibit, his name is Tom Everett. He selected this one for our digital display, our exhibit, which is in one of my research databases online, which is called Fabric of Digital Life. And we identified this one that if you think of the GoPro camera, right? So here's a wearable camera from 1886 that was inconspicuous. You could take it could take 4 photographs. It has a handheld. You pull the string down and take the photo, and but we are socialized to the idea of taking photographs. This wasn't new. So in some ways, and it has a function, it has a purpose, right? That was a spy camera, right? It was concealed. So this isn't new. So the idea that our life logging cameras were something that people want to take photos all the time now, that had a history. So another one is welder's goggles, right? Welder's goggles, we identified that as having an augmented reality. So it's a protective device, but it also sort of was a device that changed how, it filters light to protect the eyes, but it also changes light so you can see in the dark to a certain extent in certain ranges. And if you think of these devices, there's a history that we're as a society we're already used to the notion of augmenting our realities.
Wow. And is that one also a spy camera?
No, those are welder's goggles. Here's we think of exoskeletons as something that Iron Man would wear, but this is a newt suit from the 90s, and it's a diving exoskeleton. It's rigid, and you can go 700 meters down and breathe and not suffer any of the, you won't hurt your lungs or anything by wearing it. But we thought this one was sort of an interesting. What we do in our lab is we highlight all of with a metadata system of keywords these early versions of wearables, and we link them to future projections for things that inventors are making now, and try to line up what is coming down the pipeline so that it has a wearable. We have basically a forecast. We're forecasting what will happen based on what did happen.
Wow. All right, so this brings us to part 3. Are our tools and ourselves going to merge? Are they going to become one? Let's see, anyone here good at philosophy? David, are we going to become one?
I think we've been becoming one for a long time. I mean, our hand axes already, as I said, extended us. Writing as a tool extended us. Smartphones are extending us. The internet is extending us. But maybe what's happening is the technology is going to gradually become more and more automatic and more built in. Right now, say a smartphone. It's right here. It's very usable. Like maybe 30 years ago, you had information on your desktop computer, and you could go there and look it up, and probably had to be downloaded already, unless you were pretty sophisticated, and you had some stuff there. But it was clunky. Now it's a lot faster and it's more seamless. All I've got to do is pull the phone out. But in years to come, it's just going to get more and more seamless. I mean, one of the next steps is going to be augmented reality technology, where everyone's just got their glasses, which project all kinds of things into the world. And in particular, the kinds of things I right now do on my phone, I'll presumably do on my specs. I need that navigation information. It's going to be right there in front of me. The phone numbers will be there when I need them. And so it'll all be much more automatic. So in a way, that's becoming part of me. And even the next step after that is going to be the brain-computer interfaces, when somehow these devices are wired directly to my brain. So you go from having the computer sitting on your desk to having the computer in your pocket to having the computer in your glasses to basically having the computer talk directly to your brain. And at that point, I mean, maybe the last step is when the computer actually gets built into your brain, like my iPhone is basically, wired in very directly. Then maybe that's what you mean by the tools and us becoming one. But that would just be maybe one of the last stages in a process which has actually been going on for millions of years in this way of us merging with our tools.
Yeah, see, I don't know. I mean, I know that's the sci-fi, that's the easy end result of, eventually there'll be, Ray Kurzweil and the singularity, and we're all going to merge, and we'll be half cyborg and every side. But, I mean, think about what people are like. Like, first of all, who wants brain surgery? And then who wants brain surgery every year when Apple comes out with a new version? Who wants to deal with bugs when it's your brain? Right? Like, we can deal with a software patch when our phone was freezing when we opened photos, but and there's the oog factor. I mean, I just think there's all the sci-fi writers and I guess philosophers think that it's like smaller, wearable, implantable. And I'm like, there's a big wall there before implantable.
Well, you can do an awful lot with a brain-computer interface. I think it's going to turn out. Have that computer in your exocortex, but wired very directly into your brain. You're going to be able to do an awful lot that way if you're not keen on brain surgery, but you might find that then suddenly the brain is going to be a limiting factor. So there are some of your friends who are going to taking the extra step, getting the computers wired into their brains. Suddenly they're going to be a lot faster than you. They're going to be a lot smarter than you. They're going to have all these powers you don't have, and you're going to be, brain surgery, icky. On the other hand, I'd kind of like to be as smart as the Joneses.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of pressure here.
There's a bit of a dilemma here, and I'm going to provide a ridiculously long-term perspective, as I would, of course. And that is that, if you go back to the very oldest technology we know, which is just basically taking a stone, a hammer stone, hitting it against another rock in very careful ways, and you flick off a piece of stone. And well, one of the things that we see at those archaeological sites, the evidence, is that that's also the first time that you see one of the characteristics of human beings that we all take for granted, and that is that whenever you go into a grocery store, you don't just sit down in the aisle and start eating the food when you find it. You take it some other place. You begin to share it. And we have evidence of that kind of social interactivity that happens to go at the same time as that very earliest technology. The kind of technological innovation, the beginning of technological innovation in stone tool making that I mentioned much later in time also came with it, this social interactivity for the first time that connected groups with one another. You needed to begin to negotiate with groups that were groups you could not see but you knew about. And so one of the things that the dilemmas I'm seeing here is that when we're talking about the future of technology, we're talking about what's going to happen to you or to you when you get a brain implant or what. Well, my concern here is, well, what is that? What might be the social implications of that? How might we be more interactive with one another? And we can see this in information technology, whereby we are now can think of ourselves as a worldwide species. We have the capacity to do that. But I'm just wondering, in some of the other technological innovations we're talking about here, what are the societal implications?
So virtual reality is going to allow us to, to hang out in spaces together, even though we're on opposite parts of the world. I mean, the internet has already enabled this to a limited extent with email, social media, messaging. But once that actually feels physical, and I can hang out in a physical space with you, albeit in a virtual world, then that's going to transform the way we interact. Maybe we're not all going to have to fly in from around the world to the World Science Festival. We can just beam in from our offices, and it'll be just as much fun.
I was just going to say I brought another, these are augmented reality smart glasses that are brand new, that are trying to, you mentioned Google Glass, they're trying to break in where Google couldn't. It has a laser that projects back onto the eye, so it's not a visual overlay the way glass was. Yeah, it's 2D augmented reality, and it has you wear a ring controller on it, but I think I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, the reason I think glass failed is that people weren't really ready for it. There wasn't a reason to use it. It got in between you and other people. It was, it obstructed your vision.
And it had a spy camera. It freaked
Yeah,
everybody out.
right.
Take that freaking
Right.
thing off when you're talking
Yeah.
to me.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of speculation
So-
that Apple has their own glasses coming out, maybe 2020,
Right.
maybe
In-
next year.
in
maybe
fact,
very serious.
They have 45% of sort of the share. People are not adopting these and many of the other versions because they're waiting for Apple's version. Because Apple gets it right for human-computer interaction, right? They understand how people want to live. But I mean, what I think is interesting about this one, it's not necessarily, I think it's going to take a while before people actually adopt it, but it connects you with Alexa, right? It has voice commands. So, and they talk about how that you're using your technology less. So, to your point, the pitch is that you don't have to take your phone out anymore. You just wear these and call Alexa or hail another digital assistant. And I think that is, what I see on the continuum of embodiment. That if you can call your AI to help you, if you can call up a digital assistant that's going to assist you, make your life easier, then you might do it. Whether 2D augmented reality is the way that it will happen or not remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But I think that is the kind of projection towards the brain implanted AI idea. It'll step forward if humans see the value, the urgency, or the need, and that could be fabricated by external actors, or that could be marketed to people, not necessarily coming from what we naturally want to do.
Right.
We'll step forward once the teenagers found it cool. They actually want these. There were those snap glasses a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
people were
yeah.
wearing. That was a step.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
made me a bit more hopeful.
Yeah.
That maybe something like this could.
But
It's
now,
McLuhan
catch
though.
up.
Again, it's still McLuhan, right? We make our tools and they continue to shape us, right?
yeah. But now I'm with you when you talk about augmented reality. You
Yeah.
guys all know what augmented reality is. So, virtual reality is you put on this
Yeah.
opaque, heavy, expensive, tethered, sweaty goggles,
Yeah.
and you play video games and you shoot all around you. Augmented reality is when you can see through the lens, and you can do it with your phone too. Like there's this really cool app for the New York subway where you can look down through the phone at the ground beneath your feet and see what subway lines are right under you. And then you raise it like this, and there's an arrow that points you toward the station to get, things like that. That's augmented reality. And the possibilities with that are just like stunning. I was walking here thinking about if I had an augmented reality app in Manhattan when I'm looking for an apartment, like, oh man, I can't afford that one. Oh, someone was killed in that one last year. Or buying a car. You're like, this thing's been in 4 wrecks. To reveal information. You've done what to your last girlfriend? You can find out information underlying anything you're looking at.
I can just look out in the audience and say, oh my God, who's
Yeah.
that sitting in the front row? That's you and you. And no need to remember faces anymore, remember names.
It's true.
It's going to do it all
There's
for
an
me.
app, that TAT thing. It uses facial recognition. You point it at someone, it identifies them, and brings up their social media contacts. At a conference like this, oh hi, Bob. It'd be fantastic. So I'm sold. Augmented reality for sure is the future. So given all this, what is your guys' take on whether this is good or bad, or whether there is such a thing as good or bad? There's always been change, right? Like everyone's like, oh, my kids are having more social life online than offline. That's terrible. Is it terrible, or is it just different from us?
One place that I'd like to start, which is again in the distant past, is I had described earlier how the cutting tools and fire and cooking had shaped our teeth and our molars and our digestive system. But I often imagine a Homo erectus father being like, the kids today, they're not chewing properly. My chewing muscles are big. But the kids with their cutting and cooking and stuff like that. So we're already addicted to technology. So I feel like this is just an accelerating, more of the same.
You can find these complaints in ancient Greek philosophy, actually. So,
No.
Plato, around 300 BC, complained bitterly about the invention of writing. He said, the kids these days, they can't remember anything. People just write it down, and no one can actually think for themselves and remember for themselves and imagine anymore. This writing is just a crutch. for people to use, and you just pick up stuff automatically, and it's like, yeah, no one thinks for themselves. It's exactly the same stuff people are saying now about smartphones.
That, he really
the
wrote that?
Yeah, he wrote that. It's in the
That's
credit
my
list.
new favorite anecdote. Oh my gosh.
I think with regard to change, there always are going to be, well, perhaps all of us are at some point fearful of change. But that's not the good or the bad. I think it's a different axis of or dichotomy, and that is intended consequences and unintended consequences of technology. We see this in the age of humans in which we live, just in ways in which we change our environment. That is also a product of technology, and our survival, again, the deep time perspective is that human survival, our survival strategy is that we alter the world. You can just see this with regard to fire, with regard to tools and so on. And this is really just, this discussion is an extension of the fact that this human impulse to change our surroundings, including building tools, is just part and parcel of who we are. The question really becomes, to what extent, and I think this is where maybe the fear or the bad might come in some people's estimation, is that there are unintended consequences with regard to human isolation, with regard to things that are done to the environment, whatever. And I think that's the part that's hard to foresee. The question is how, humans are really, really good. We're all really good at changing the world, changing the environment. But we're also really good at changing ourselves, and that also comes through technology. We wouldn't have all the diversity of culture, all these different expressions of what human looks like around the world, if we weren't malleable, if we weren't able to change ourselves, not necessarily purposefully, but it is just part and parcel, again, of our species.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, what
How
I
does
mean is
diversity
that if you look at languages and the reason why there are, even though they're dwindling, 6,000 different languages in the world, is that there is this property of Homo sapiens that diversifies. And that cultures, how many cultures are there in the world? Well, culture, it's hard to count.
Let's see, Instagram,
Yeah.
Twitter, Facebook.
I'm talking anthropologically here, but and those are really hard sometimes for people to understand. Well, how can a person act like that in a different culture? And yet, it's part and parcel of who we are as human beings. And so, we change the world through our technology. The technology changes us, and I think the question ahead is: can we live a life purposefully with that technology in a way that makes sense, that builds meaning? Because I think that things fall apart when we invent things, when we adopt things, and somehow we don't find the meaningful purposes of them.
Wow. Isabel, what are some of the other technology-human merging things you guys have been looking at? I read something about ingestibles. What's that?
Yeah, so the concept that I've been working with this model that we're on a sort of a continuum of embodiment, or that we assume that we are. We feel that it's inevitable. It isn't. We create these technologies and introduce them into our lifestyle, but we see ourselves as this. It's a bit of a ruse. But ingestible technologies are technologies that you swallow. One example is microrobots that you swallow and perform a function in the body. It could be to diagnose disease, or it could be to correct something. And I think people are a little bit more comfortable with the idea of ingestible technology than they are, say, a brain implant or another kind of implant. People are implanting devices into their hands, for example.
The ID, RFID.
Yeah. For security.
Yeah, company that gave their employees the option of embedding an ID chip in their wrist, so they can come into the headquarters just by swiping their wrist at a turnstile instead of needing a badge.
Right.
And they've had what percentage sign up, 30% or something?
Something like that, yeah. And this is always the sort of lowest hanging fruit, right? You can convince someone to implanted chip in their hand, if you say, well, just, it's going to help you open the door, you don't have to pull out your ID badge and, to use the printer and things like that. But I think what's interesting is the suggestion that it'll begin to perform functions well beyond the sort of physical. That kind of fascinates me. And ingestible, there aren't that many examples of there are some, but smart pills or micro robots or that kind of idea. But people like the fact that they're sort of transient through the body, that you're not going to, you'd have to have those chips removed if you ever wanted them out.
Yeah.
Although what they're talking about now are minuscule. I mean, some of the brain chips they're talking about implanting are very tiny. This one is, a grain of rice, that size. So,
Like they put in the dog necks,
yeah.
dog IDs.
Yeah. But I think, what really fascinates me, and it also relates to your research, is Elon Musk's Neuralink and the idea of brain-implanted AI. Mm-hmm. And that, along with the research for creative AI, so AI that is creating, works of art or is able to compose or, writing, that fascinates me. So what happens with that kind of convergence?
That's the merger of two different technologies, both of which are moving fast right now. AI, brain-computer interfaces, or maybe likewise AI and augmented reality. Like you already talked about combining your augmented reality glasses with AI that recognizes faces and people for you. Put those two things together, suddenly your mind doubles in power because you've got an AI mind which becomes part of your mind.
Implant facial recognition library. All of it, right? So that you would suddenly know everyone, and this is a speculative future, right? This is a speculative future, and this is what I'm getting at is that if we dismiss it as speculative, as science fiction, how are we going to address it when the difficult social problems that we're experiencing come up, like they are now, right? We're sort of blindsided by it instead of having a measured approach to the future.
But see, I'm fascinated and frustrated by the fear thing. As you hinted, every new technology creates a fear backlash, and I've done a lot of studying this. I mean, you mentioned reading. When the first steam locomotives started in Europe in the early 1800s, there were these articles, you must have read about this, that they would make you mad, send you crazy. No human being had ever gone at the unheard of speed of 35 miles an hour before. It was like unheard of. And women were advised not to get on one of those because, I kid you not, your uterus would fall out, make you sterile. That's what there was this one German journal that said, don't get on the steam locomotive. The microwave was supposed to give you cancer. People say this will give you brain cancer. It doesn't, by the way. Anything to the left of visible light on the electromagnetic spectrum, like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and cell phone and AM and FM radio, those don't give you cancer. It's the one on the other side, like X-rays, those give you cancer. Anyway, and tractors were called the work of the devil, and airplanes, commercial air travel began, and there were journals saying, don't get on one of those things, the blood will pool in the back of your heart and kill you. So if we could strip away the knee-jerk fear of every new technology, what would remain? What are going to be the things that are being held back just by our knee-jerk fear right now, besides brain implants?
Did you see that cover story in The Atlantic maybe 10, 15 years ago? Is Google making us stupid? And it was like, it was this fear that's okay, there it is.
Oh, wow.
That somehow, no one can think for themselves anymore. That was an amazing brain-computer interface. I just had to think it, and it came up on screen. But without these technologies, people worry that we're becoming dependent on these technologies, and that's always a worry for every technology. Like, without the the horse or the car, it like atrophies our ability to walk long distances. Yeah, because now without the car, we're not going to be able to walk as far. Okay, but most of the time we have the car. With the car, we can get further. Without Google or without the smartphone, maybe we're no longer nearly as capable anymore. Put me in that Survivor episode, and I'm not going to do so well. But fortunately, most of the time we're not without them. As long as the technology is there around us, it's extending us, it's making us better. So I would actually argue Google is making us smarter, not more stupid, as long as it's actually around to serve as an extension of me. Now, if if there's suddenly, thermonuclear war and the internet disappears and goes down, and we're suddenly back to the stage of 2 million years ago, then maybe those
We'll all find Rick wherever he is.
maybe those early hominids are going to be doing a lot better than us. But for right now, with the technology, I think it serves to extend us. It also serves to free up a lot of things that we had to used to worry about. People think this is going to automate our minds, it's going to turn us into machines. No, machines take over the dumb stuff we didn't need to know, remembering the phone numbers, navigating, whatever. What's left is our own conscious creativity at the center to make our lives what we want. So I think we should not lose sight of the person who's at the center of all this technology.
Right. Now, do you guys agree? I mean, that's sort of an optimistic viewpoint.
I'm a glass half full guy by nature.
Yeah. I don't completely
I mean, I just
agree.
think it's inevitable that we're going to have to address these problems. So, I mean, I agree with your point of view on that. It's coming. We just got to be ready for it. The one thing we haven't discussed is CRISPR, right? So now we can just pick our own evolutionary path, right? So it's going to be intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree that it's not going to sort of make us stupid and that, but I think, in Toronto we have one of the sister companies, Google's sister company is Alphabet. Alphabet owns Sidewalk Labs, which is creating a neighborhood in Toronto. They have an agreement with all levels of government to create an ambient space within the city that will be controlled by Sidewalk Labs. That's the company owned by Alphabet, which also owns Google. And I think the problem there is with those ambient interfaces, right, around the body, controlling the data that you have on your phone to a certain extent, or pulling the data out of your phone, or also where you walk, where you go, and eventually how you think. I think we have to figure out how, with people who are going to commercialize your thoughts, your feelings, your social networks, your other aspects of what you do. We have to measure that with some difficult questions.
I think that's fair. I mean, every technology produces wonderful things and terrible things. The internet has done amazing things and awful things. Nuclear technology, amazing things and awful things.
Absolutely.
I think we can assume that's going to happen with each of these. But I think we should throw in the by and large, in most cases, you weigh the amazing things that these technologies do against the awful things. And my own view is that most of the time the good things come out ahead.
We should approach the awful things as problems to be solved, right?
Yeah.
We should anticipate them as much as possible. And
I
mean, it's just like the spear can be used to get dinner, or it can be used to attack the guys in the next valley, right?
Paul Virilio says that when you build the ship, you also build a shipwreck. And
I'm using that too. That's really good.
I step back from this and see that the we here, we share the planet with almost 7.8 billion people. And I wonder sometimes, again, as an anthropologist who studies the long-term view, about the implications for others and the importance of people becoming involved through, with the decisions that affect the lives of the planet. And the technologies we often talk about and want to embrace and are excited about. In traveling around the world, sometimes to pretty remote places, I see people who are extremely eager to adopt. And that is actually a very useful thing for our discussion to know, is that this is not just something that, innovations are not just something restricted to Western society or to East Coast or West Coast or whatever, but it's something that people are very, very interested in. But out of that 7.8 billion people, nearly 7.8 billion people, 5 billion people don't have sanitation and enough food and water. And so where do they go? And so I think that our technology allows us to see a humanity, a common humanity, in a way that is really, really important and meaningful to us. But there are going to be people left out if we're not careful.
That notion of the being left behind, I'm still hung up on that thing about the Joneses will have the brain implants and I won't. I did a story for CBS Sunday Morning last week about self-driving cars and where we're at with that. And I was talking to one of the CEOs of one of the self-driving car companies who said, I said, well, surely people who like to drive can still drive. And he said, for now. But there's going to come a time when people who want to drive themselves are considered a danger to everybody else, like anti-vaxxers. Like, get off my road, you're endangering my perfect car.
You thought gun control was a big cultural war.
Yeah.
Wait until it's car control.
Yeah. So we'll take your questions in just a second, give you a second to think them up. In the meantime, do you guys have any final thoughts on tools, humans, and the future? You had a really good one, Rick, so you're off the hook. The long view.
I was reminded, actually, while this discussion was going on, when you presented this question of the future. How can we possibly know it? And of a quote from a novel by Barbara Kingsolver, where she said, "The past is all we know of the future." And what she was meaning there is that it's only through our experiences. It's only by studying what has happened, in this case, with past technologies. I don't mean past like what I study, but even just things in the last 10 years, that we begin to be able to have a sense of being able to project, to model what things could be done and what things are best to be careful about in how we embrace technology.
I didn't talk about any of the optimistic things, but I think with brain implants, there's great capacity to restore or help people with memory challenges. There's going to be a lot of innovation in that regard, helping people who need it. Augmented memory is a fascinating one that's been around for a long time. People have been working on the idea of storing memories, and that one fascinates me too.
It's sounding like none of you have ever watched Black Mirror.
We've all, I watch Black Mirror.
I'm not hearing a lot of dystopia up here.
I mean, I've written a lot about how, I fear that our memories will be sort of collapsed, like the wonderful, rich human memories. How do we experience nostalgia or grief? Or how do we remember, our childhood memories? And they're so visceral and sensory. What will happen? Will they be collapsed if they're just sort of visuals, right? Will the brain change, and we won't have synesthetic kind of capacities to remember things through other senses, and all these things do concern me. But
just a quick follow-up on that is, so I've worked in societies where hardly anyone has ever seen a photograph.
okay,
And so I'll bring photographs back after having been away for years, and they're like, wow.
yeah,
And they see themselves at a younger age. So you imagine it being in a world where you couldn't look at your childhood self or your kids years later and stuff like that. So,
and
we gain memories too.
Or we change. I mean, there's some of us who have read all of James Joyce Ulysses and can imagine and think what that experience was like. Or a book, books that describe things, and the mind goes racing back to something that happened in childhood. And I think what your point was, we will change, but doesn't mean everything will be collapsed necessarily.
I mean, I think these tools that transform us, they really at least have the capacity to improve us. They don't necessarily improve us, but they've always got that capacity. And I think, looking back over history, different tools have improved us and improved society in all kinds of ways. I mean, the invention of writing or the invention of the printing press were ways of spreading ideas throughout society that led to things like the Enlightenment and to massive social and moral progress. Looking at future technologies, I think these ways of extending ourselves. I mean, even the internet, which gives us, and tools like this, which give us the ability to think collectively, that's enabled us to come to grips with problems that we couldn't come to grips with before by thinking collectively. Yeah, okay, we're still working on climate change, but maybe in the future, as we get these extended, we start extending ourselves with the aid of say artificial intelligence and so on. That may give us all the more capacity to solve these problems, to solve scientific problems, to solve social problems, to solve moral problems. I mean, it's not a panacea, but I think it gives us more capacity. It gives us more ability. It's up to us. It's up to us to use it. But that's ultimately what makes me optimistic, is by giving us the capacity to think better, to be better. And that ought to be a chance that we can take.
I like it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions for our esteemed guests? Yes, sir.
I had a professor named Houston Smith.
Oh, you got a mic coming.
Thank you. I had a professor named Houston Smith, and he used to say technology or science could be a springboard or a straitjacket. I'm like you, optimist by nature, but examples I've heard is that what he used to say is if your whole world's materialistic, you sort of forget your perennial nature of humans being more spiritual. And so materialism offers you all these new ways. You don't have to go down to the river to wash the clothes, all the things you're talking about, even more advanced. And I've heard that children, especially teenagers, are developing that they, instead of having the sort of the village influencing them or your neighborhood of 300, 3,000, 20,000 people, now they're having 3 million people observing them, so they're starting to lose themselves and sort of not developing or having a sort of set of shared values, and so they're sort of being afraid to even think for themselves. So I feel like if you go to an extreme level, you have the Borg from Star Trek, where we're all a hive mind, don't even have our own voices. So I would just like you to talk about the spiritual side and like how that affects people emotionally.
Yeah, I think that that's part of what I was getting at with regard to how technology, how will it ultimately be related to meaning making. And we create meaning through religion, philosophy, artistic endeavors, through science, and so on. And how I liked this, what we were just talking about, and how we ended this part of the evening, was this idea that, and it does go back to the earliest technologies that I study, which is that technology and its embrace also happens to have implications for how connected people feel, and how they as individuals will feel part of that connection. And so I think that that's a very important part of our consideration here.
I could add I did a study on how autobiography is now sort of transforming to automedia, and how post-millennials understand themselves as telling the stories of the self. It's like life writing or autobiography, that when they're circulating images around the world, they're really telling the story of themselves, and that we have to see it that way, not collapse what they're doing, but they're actually trying to communicate and leave behind something of themselves, the way an autobiography would, or a pictographic image on a cave is, I was here, I existed, and I had a life of value.
So I think that technologies this is more or less orthogonal. It seems to me they could potentially enhance religion, spirituality. So the printing press, which was mentioned earlier, was part of what drove the spread of Protestant information, the Protestant Reformation. The Bible remains the most printed book of all time. This number 2 book at the time was The Imitation of Christ, and there were all these penitentials and whatnot. So, those don't have to be at odds.
Well, thank you guys for coming out. Thank you guys for coming out. We'll be hanging around if you have any follow-up questions. Nice to meet you.
All right.